Hi there, and welcome to our panel on the Australian News Media Bargaining Code and its aftermath. We are starting by exploring the overall distribution of news on Facebook in Australia as background. We're then moving on to a paper on the News Media Bargaining Code itself and the way that Google and Facebook in particular responded to it. A third paper will further address the brief news ban that Facebook instituted in February 2021 in response to the News Media Bargaining Code. And then finally, in a fourth paper, we will assess whether the code as designed is actually working or not. So let's jump right in.
We're going to talk about the broader industry relationships between Facebook and the Australian news media. There was one core motivation for this study. We knew that Facebook had overhauled the newsfeed in January 2018 and that news organisations weren't doing as well on Facebook. This was reported widely in industry publications. We got further evidence of this when we did our own study on the relationship between Facebook and Australian news in 2020. But this was all interviews and we wanted to get some hard data. We knew that news was doing badly, but just how badly? Was the variance between sectors? We also wanted to find out how Australia was doing overall. Could we say something about the Australian news sector in general? So the goal of this study was to actually get numbers from Facebook and see what was going on at a national level.
For the analysis, we used two data sources. We obtained about 2 million posts published by 32 Facebook pages of Australian news organizations from CrowdTangle. These posts were all published between January 2014 and December 2020. We also used traffic data obtained from SEMrush to the main websites of 26 Australian news organizations. To extract a meaningful, noiseless trend lines for the engagement around 2 million Facebook posts, we define a performance score by removing the most and the least engaged posts, and finally by averaging engagement for the remaining posts for a series of 30-day moving windows. In this figure, we see the performance score of reactions for the entire industry, a weighted average of 32 individual performance scores, where 1 is the performance score measured over our arbitrary baseline period, January-April 2017. We clearly see a significant decline under the peak of 2015 and the industry mostly underperforming relatively to the baseline period of after 2016.
However, while the industry has been underperforming overall on Facebook after 2016, there's also been significant differences between news genres. As you can see here, while print, television, and social news outlets like BuzzFeed saw their Facebook engagement decline in the second half of the past decade, public service media outlets instead experienced somewhat more success during the same period. Overall, content from the Australian media sector is performing worse on Facebook. But yet there remains variance between genres. We can't prove causal links, but some factors could help explain our findings. For example, Facebook's changes to its newsfeed algorithms, as well as changes in audience behavior, could help explain the decline in news engagement. News companies could also be pursuing different audience strategies. And off-platform factors could also help explain the variance between genres. For instance, Australians' long-standing trust in public service media. If you're interested in learning more about our research, please read our full paper. Thank you for listening.
Hi, my name is Tama. I'm a Professor of Internet Studies at Curtin University. My contribution to this panel is to discuss how Google and Facebook fought Australia's news media bargaining code and why both companies ultimately believe that they won that battle. As outlined in other papers in this panel, the full draft of the Australian News Media Bargaining Code, or the NMBC, was tabled in July 2020 by the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission with the ostensible aim of creating a more level playing field for news producers and companies to bargain with the digital giants for some form of payment for the news content that they were sharing and aggregating. Initially, only Google and Facebook would be targets of this code. All Australian news companies could use the code. Both sides would be invited to negotiate for terms, but the code specified a model of arbitration that tended to favour the smaller party. Digital and social media companies were required to give 28 days notice before any changes to their news sorting algorithms could be changed, and penalties for violating the code could be tens of millions of dollars. Google initially went hard on a PR battle, employing comedians, assailing the Australian public with videos and pop-ups arguing that the code was deeply unfair. Then in January 2020, they pulled out the really big guns and threatened to pull Google search completely from Australia. This was a threat that many responded to with great fear. Obviously, the public suddenly got very worried that the Google that they were depending on would be removed. And ultimately, Google did not follow through with this threat and instead made deals with news companies and basically continued to be the darling of Australian search. Facebook, on the other hand, was initially very quiet. Then in February 2021, shocked everyone by blocking all news on the platform in Australia, which led to some very tense behind-the-scenes negotiations where Facebook did get some last-minute concessions and did eventually return news after 10 days. So, bizarrely, in the code battle for the code, almost everyone claims to have won. Facebook returned news, but with concessions, with new limits on the way that news was defined, and limits on what they could be asked to pay. Google looked amazing, having never removed search, was praised by the Australian government. The code became law, but without teeth because it had no initial targets or designations, which another paper we'll talk about in this panel. The Australian government looks to have battled Goliath and won, forcing Google and Facebook to pay. Rupert Murdoch, of course, got more money. The only real loser was probably the small and regional news services in Australia, who would have found it much harder than to negotiate. What we do need to note is that this isn't just an Australian story. This is a battle that has global ramifications, and we've seen since the NMBC became law that there has been significant global discussion about regulation across the world, including payment for news in many other jurisdictions and many other countries. There's some references, pause to read them. So the first publication from my work on the News Media Bargaining Code has recently been published in the MC Journal. Please take a look at that. There are other papers in the pipeline, so please feel free to get in touch via email, via Twitter, and hope to talk to you and engage soon. Cheers.
Hi everyone, I'm presenting this on behalf of my colleague Dan Angus and myself. There will also be a longer version of this video. We're talking about Facebook's Australian news ban. So let's start with the threads being made when the Australian government first introduced this Australian News Media Bargaining Code. When this first happened, Google flashed up these kinds of warnings saying your search experience will be hurt by the new regulation. Facebook was more explicit in saying we will reluctantly stop allowing publishers and people in Australia from sharing local and international news on Facebook and Instagram. The Australian Consumer Watchdog said, well, that's probably not going to happen because so many Australians are using Facebook for news, but Facebook pointed out that, well, that might be true, but news is only a small part of what happens on Facebook in Australia, so they might still be doing it. The Australian government, in its turn, said, well, this is just a bluff and we're not playing poker with them. We're not going to let ourselves be bullied into doing anything. However, unfortunately, it turned out this wasn't a bluff. So on the 18th of February, Australian users woke up to empty Facebook pages of news organizations. This is the Australian public broadcaster, ABC. When they were trying to access news content directly, they couldn't. When they were trying to post content on Facebook, they couldn't. And in fact, even newsy pages on Facebook, like the Bureau of Meteorology, or most problematically, the various health departments of Australian states, had empty pages as well. Of course, that's a really significant problem in the middle of a pandemic, as you can imagine. So the overall impact was that sharing of links to Australian news sites on Australian Facebook pages dropped down significantly, but not quite to zero. However, interactions with those posts, even when they were still being made, dropped down to zero. So people could not see any posts, even if they're being made, and they certainly couldn't interact with them. This is the Facebook news ban period. However, Facebook is also right that during this time, other activities on Facebook basically continued without any change. So the various links to other sites being shared were still at very much the same level during this time. Interactions with those links were also at the same level. It was only news content that dropped down significantly. And the only other drop down that we saw was just for a weekend, which is quite normal on Facebook. The sites that lost most interaction, or the links to these sites that lost most interaction, were of course news sites, so people simply could not access those posts anymore. News satire, however, flourished during this time, so links to news satire pages, interactions grew, doubled essentially, and interactions with Google links also almost doubled, and this was because people were sharing essentially links to Google searches on news topics as a way to still share news on Facebook, because Facebook had not banned the sharing of Google links as such on Facebook. Other areas that did well out of this were lifestyle, food, and sports sites. Links to those sites were shared and interacted with quite significantly during this time. So this is really where Australian users went when news was no longer available. And at the same time, we did not see any significant increase in the sharing of links to fake news sites, which is at least encouraging. The overall aftermath of all of this is, of course, that the government has changed its approach to this News Media Bargaining Code, essentially changing it so that it no longer covers Google and Facebook, that they are exempt from it, as long as they pay some small amount of money by comparison to Australian news publishers. They continue to be exempt. So that's the overall story of the Facebook Australian news ban. More information in our longer video, as I've said. Thank you very much.
Okay, key takeaways in a couple of minutes on the News Media Bargaining Code for my paper. The first one is that Facebook and Google did not like the News Media Bargaining Code, and they leveraged their own significant user base and platform in Australia to campaign against it, which was quite shocking. Now, the tactics worked, particularly Facebook's tactic, which was to pull news completely from the Facebook news feed. That worked in that the Australian government didn't designate either platform when the code passed Parliament. So the two platforms basically didn't want to have the code apply to them at all, didn't want the legislation around at all. And if the legislation was passed, they wanted to not be named in it. So their tactics and their strategies, which I suggest they'll use in other countries that attempt to introduce similar legislation, worked. So the other key takeaway is that in not naming the platforms in the legislation as it was passed, the government actually created a bargaining chip that they could use to get the platforms to do what they wanted. So in not designating them, the Treasurer said, we want you to behave as though the code applied to you and to go out and make deals with news media organisations in Australia. And indeed, that's what the platforms are doing and have done. And so in that sense, it's been quite successful as a code, to my mind at least, because it has already enriched the media industry here. And some of the sums that news organisations have acquired as a result of this code, particularly from Google, are game-changing for Australian journalism.